Hello and welcome to another episode of How to Build a Theatre, a podcast charting the creation of a new theatre for Brussels through looking at the wider theatre industry. My name is Edward Macmillan.
And my name is Phil Wilcox. It's lovely to see you, Ed. How you doing?
Lovely to see you too, Phil. I'm very well, thank you.
So what's been going on with the bridge? Oh,
Yes, I was going to say I was actually in a very green space last week because I was in, we were doing our summer workshop for young people. So we had 10 to 15-year-olds with us last week in a very green place called Grand Hospice, which is a big old hospice in the centre of Brussels. And in there they have two big courtyards, which are very nice to hang out with. I mean, we were in the courtyards for our lunch breaks and some of the classes as well. But the summer workshop went very well. So that's 5 days of acting, singing and dancing for children, culminating in a little showing for parents and friends at the end of the week. And we used Matilda the musical from the West End as our inspiration for that week. And it's always a scary thing to go into this week because you only have 5 days and you never really know. We don't know. I mean, we obviously have applications from the participants, but we don't know most of them. We knew a few of them from the previous year, but we don't really know who's going to turn up. So it's a complete open book when we arrive on Monday, and then by the Friday you have to put on a show. So it's a real whirlwind week, very very tiring, but really fun. And yeah, I was again so happy and proud with what they managed to achieve in just 5 days. Really, it's less than 5 days. It's like 4 days. It's amazing.
it's amazing, isn't it? What you go into with the right people with the right people, both at the leading, but also with the right people attending. You never know what's going to be created, but something always happens.
Yeah, and I think,
and thankfully, it's always good.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the kids this year were particularly enthusiastic, which obviously helps, and they were all loving it. I remember just asking a few of the older ones on the first day, kind of, how are you feeling about it? And they were like, oh yeah, it's like school but fun. I was like, yes, yeah. That's it, because it is intense like school, and you're with your classmates for the week, but they're up and active all week and doing things and learning new things, and yeah, it's just a great atmosphere. So anyway, I'm still obviously on a little bit of a high from that, and starting to actually think about the next year, I guess. Yeah, good link.
So is there anything else? We're going into September now. Is there anything planned? Have you got any irons in the fire for the autumn season?
So the venue search continues in earnest. I'm going to see a few different local arts venues over the next few days, because that will enable us to actually do a production. And in the meantime, we're just setting up our weekly weekend workshops, as we call them, and that's for adults. I think that going forward, with the summer workshop, it really shows that this format works very well with kids and young people, and I think that that's how we'll continue going forward. These intense things for young people, and then maybe more weekly things for adults. I'm still debating on that, but yes, I mean, I really like this intense format. It really works very, very well. Shall we introduce our guest, Phil?
Let's do it.
Yeah. So we invited onto this episode a lady called Marie de Wit, if I'm saying that roughly correctly. So I've known Marie for about a year, I guess, or so, and she works at an organisation called Promethea here in Brussels, and we will get into that a little bit as we go along. I think I don't want to say too much right now, but for now, I just want to say hello and welcome, Marie.
Hello. Happy to be here.
Great to have you on. So, Phil, should we do a little warm-up with Marie, expose her to the trials that is your quickfire questions?
Oh my goodness, absolutely, yeah. All right, then here we go, Marie. Where are you coming from today? What's your situation? Are you in your place of work or place of living?
Place of living, yes. I usually work from home on Tuesdays.
Oh, very good. Oh, so okay. Is the setup in Brussels largely similar to um, what it is over here? Are you sort of doing a couple of days in, a couple of days out, or is it are you allowed to
I
work at home
think
as much as
that's,
you like?
something that emerged from the COVID period, and I think we're all happy to stay at least one day a week at home, just to do calls like this, for example, because I work in an open space, so it's
Yeah.
much more relaxed to do this type of things from home.
This isn't the quickfire question. This is just interesting conversation. Right, here come the quickfire questions. The tea or coffee question. Do you do tea or coffee?
Coffee.
How many coffees do you have a day?
Ooh,
Is that too personal?
4.
4? Oh, wow, okay. Is it milky or is it espresso-based
Black.
coffee? Black.
Yeah,
Fine.
short, black.
Excellent. Season. Have you got a favourite season of the year?
I guess winter.
Oh, yeah. Give us something that scares you. Do you have a phobia or?
Classic one, spiders.
Yeah, ditto. You're at the bar. Let's say it's early doors. You've gone, Friday night. You've finished up. You closed up shop. You've gone down there. It's 5 o'clock, something like that. What do you order?
Oh, I'm Belgian. A beer, of course.
Naturally. What was your worst, or you could do either worst and or favourite subject at school?
Favorite history, and I went on studying archaeology, was what they call technology, where basically it was an old person teaching us to use Word and Excel, which we knew better.
Sadly, I think they still do that in schools. I think they still teach kids Word and Excel. And you're like, this is... Yeah.
Finally, then, this sort of links to usually night and day. I'm often interested in the are you a night owl or an early bird question, but let's switch it to do you sunrise or sunset?
Sunset.
Leading to that you're maybe a night owl?
Night owl,
Yeah.
all the way.
Yeah. Kindred spirit. There we go. The here ends our quickfire question round. You've done very well, Marie. That was 9.8 out of 10. Thank you.
Ding, ding, ding.
Yay.
Thank you very much, Phil. I think we had a little taster actually of your background there, but I'd like to just, before we talk about your work at Promethea and perhaps also the financing of cultural institutions, maybe it would be nice to tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got involved in Promethea, I guess. So you originally studied architecture?
Archaeology.
Archaeology, sorry.
Yeah. Yes, and I was all set to have a fascinating and boring academic career. I was doing research at ULB for a few years, doing my PhD, and I guess it sort of coincides when COVID hit. I decided I wanted a bit more of a purpose, I was getting a bit bored and stuck studying ancient pottery. And I wanted to do something I was maybe a bit more anchored in the present and in my city, because I was doing Greek archaeology. I was not feeling very legitimate studying that anyway. But so yeah, that's my background. It's very academic, very nerdy, and certainly not in the financial aspects of culture. So I made a big leap going to Promethea, but in a way I keep a foot in, the sphere of culture and heritage. So
So maybe just to explain a little bit to the listeners, you can tell us what Promethea is and what your role there is.
So we're a non-profit organization, and we are, let's say, the broad description is that we're the interface between culture heritage, and the private sector. We try to build bridges between the two, but so mostly through sponsorship, but what we call in French mécénat, which is a bit of a soft sponsorship, let's say. So it's a financial or in skill or in kind support of the private sector to the cultural sector. But we don't really like to call it sponsorship, because it's not just, putting the logo at the bottom of a poster and just a transaction. We try to really build partnerships, true partnerships that are beneficial for the two parties. So broadly saying, that's what we do. We try to build bridges between culture and the private sector.
Is that about finding where the two ideas, where the cultural sector and the private sector, where they cross over, or is it just finding about where they? Because sometimes I guess they won't be related. The two, the one funding the other, they might not be definitely related. But is it about, for your job then? Is it finding where one can?
Where it could be mutually beneficial. It is, in a way, it is sponsorship. So it is a business, a private company giving money to a cultural project. But we want the two parties to really build a relationship, and we want to insist on how it is really beneficial to the company to support cultural projects. There are many things in return that they can get, from the experience, to have more of an adhesion from their employees, because they feel happier at work knowing that it's a place that does good. Of course, it helps notoriety. It's a way to talk about yourself, but indirectly. So there are many things we can build between two parties, and sometimes the best partnerships we build are the ones that are there for the long run. Years after years, the supports are renewed, and then the artists or whatever, the performers can do stuff at their place of work, like stuff like that. That's really what we want to develop, is real partnerships.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like from the website as well, I just got the website up, you've got a list of the cultural partners, which ranges from, by the looks of it, orchestras, theatres, opera theatre, museums. Is there some TV and film in there? Some of the names I don't recognise, and then actually looking at your private partners, there's a huge list of organisations from all over the sector.
Yes, that was one of the main preoccupations of Promethea. So it was founded in the mid-80s. So we're quite an old organization, let's say. So it was always the goal to have a mix of large and small companies, large scale number of employees to the smallest business, and same with the cultural partners. So the list you can see there are our official, let's say, cultural partners with whom we have a bit more of a closer relationship, but we help from the smallest non-profit to the largest national museums.
And do you know a bit more about what prompted the organization Promethea to be set up in the 80s?
It is an emanation of the Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles. There's no way to translate that, I think. So the link, it's at the community level. There, in Belgium, too many levels of power.
So this is the government of the French-speaking community.
French-speaking community of Wallonie and Brussels, which is the instance that is the largest funder of culture, I guess, in terms of public funding. So it was the initiative of this federation and a handful of large companies, mainly with the aim of supporting theatre at the very beginning, but then it extended to any type of cultural matters and topics and heritage.
I find it fascinating that the impetus also came from the private sector. In my kind of perception, perhaps, this kind of support to the cultural sector can be quite foreign to the private sector in Belgium. I mean, maybe that's a misreading of the situation.
I mean, the situation in the 80s was clearly different, because even though we don't really have that is true that we don't have a culture of not philanthropy, but of corporate sponsorship. Clearly, we don't really have that historically, or not as much as you can have perhaps in the UK, certainly not as the US, because, well, for several reasons. But the first is that we are, all companies included, heavily taxed, and a large chunk of that money goes back to the cultural sector through subsidies. So there is the knowledge that, you know, it's like we're not a tipping culture at cafes and restaurants, because we know that the waiting staff is, well paid. I wouldn't go that far, but you know. So that, and also because, well, there is not really any fiscal measures that would give the extra push for private donations, and so we don't have the system in place for individual philanthropists. So if you do a donation of any amount above 40 euros, you have a 40% tax cut. That only exists for private individuals, not for companies. Whereas you have in France proper legislation that really gives a legal frame to what is eligible for a company to any form of tax cut. And that's what we call mécénat. So it's somewhere between pure donation and sponsorship. It's when the thing that the company gets in return is strongly disproportionate compared to the amount they actually gave. And that we don't have in Belgium. And so originally Promethea was also created as a lobby, you know, to make this fiscal situation shift. But, you know, it's been 35 years and it's still the same.
This sounds a little bit like the in the UK we've got gift aid, which is essentially an incentive to give charitably by private individuals. Private individuals can gift aid. I'm not sure. I assume companies can as well. And it's essentially I think, in my little understanding of it, it is essentially as you described the first thing you mentioned there, it's essentially any money that you've given. I think actually it's more that it's going to get topped up a bit by the government, because it's money that's been taxed already, I assume, and the tax that you've paid on that comes back. But it actually benefits the charity or the culture, and a lot of cultural institutions which are set up as charities, lots of choirs, theatres, etc., which might have a charity wing or be set up as charities, will benefit from that. Yeah. It's not a cost to the original donator, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then for a very specific sector, that is cinema and also theatre, but on a very large scale. Of course, in Belgium, we have the tax shelter system that, please don't ask me to explain because it's extremely complex. But basically, you can deduct the amount you give, you can deduct from the part that will be taxed. So it is a huge benefit, and it has created a lot of jobs in Belgium, because a lot of movies do at least their post-prod in Belgium and have to hire a certain amount of Belgian technicians and workers. So this is a great system that was put in place. Of course, there are many criticisms, but that you need to invite a specialist of that of tax shelter to discuss that. There is a saying in Belgium that if you think you've understood tax shelter, it's that you really haven't.
Yeah, but from also a newcomer perspective, my perspective, you can see the effect that tax shelter has had on the film industry. It's really, really well developed here in Belgium, and the system, Phil, was introduced for new theatrical productions, I think, in 2018, and it's starting to trickle down now for theatres as well. And you kind of see this benefit again. Yeah, It's beyond my knowledge also how it really works, but it's a way of getting the money into the cultural sector. We're saying that, you know, in Belgium we don't really have in Belgium we don't really have a culture of corporate philanthropy, let's say. It was true when they founded Promethea in the 80s, but now, of course, most companies have to have, it's not like they don't legally have to, but everyone has a CSR policy. Most, especially large companies now, you know, they
There's a dedicated page on their website that describe their sustainable development goals. So this is the culture of the business culture now, is to have a positive impact in your chosen SDGs. And of course, culture is not explicitly one of them, but any cultural project can be the vehicle for these SDGs. So gender equality, eco-responsibility. So we are still useful in the way to, in the sense that there is still a need to promote the fact that culture is one great aspect of well-being, personal development, friendly society, you know. And so I think we still have a lot of work to do, to convince companies that, you know, culture is one major axis in which they can have an impact on society.
It's funny, isn't it? Because you think back, I mean, you say that we don't have, let's broaden it out to Europe. It's within the last sort of 50 years leading up to the 80s, didn't have a culture of philanthropic supporting of the arts. Go back a couple of centuries and everyone with money funded, had a composer living in their house, an artist, because it was an act of, I don't know, I suppose I've never read anything about it. Obviously I know that great composers always existed on philanthropy and patronage, and you'd have court musicians and you'd have court theatrical performers. It's funny to think when that fell out, I assume at the time it was largely associated with the show. It was, I have a, you want to come into my court, I've got a theatre.
I have the best composer in my court,
And then at some point, of course, now it sounds like you're still having to tell, almost it's sort of explain to companies why it's a good thing to support the arts, to support stuff that's inverted commas just purely good for society. It's almost sort of pure philanthropy.
Well, yes, indeed, because they don't really, they don't really have to. No. It's a benevolent act, it is still generosity, even though, attached to that, of course, there is when you want to support a concert, how does it work? So one of the jobs I do is to help people, all cultural operators, to develop something that will speak to a potential private partner. What do they want? They want notoriety and they want a return in experience. So not just to have tickets to your show because they can just buy it, but to go backstage, maybe to have something a bit more exceptional. There is a form of, this old patronage thing, a bit of pride that, my company does that, can buy the access to that privilege. And then there's notoriety, but in a way, they absolutely don't have to do it, A company, a business is supposed to keep their revenue and to reinject it in their own activity.
I think it's very easy as well to think about business, to think about the company, and obviously, certainly in a pretty heavily capitalist society, we could be. You could easily sort of jump on the bandwagon of going, keeping hold of all that money, your dreadful blood-sucking parasite. If you actually zoom in on business, what you've got there is a collection of individuals, many of whom will be, art lovers, people who want to be kind and want to do good. And of course, they're individuals as part of a big company. What does the company itself stand for? And that's obviously up to a collection of individuals.
Exactly, and that's why we have, I think, today we have 122 companies that are members of Promethea. It is true, I think mostly the individuals that are passionate about the art, theatres, that they really wanted their business to do something good, and to know that it contributes greatly to the well-being of people. I think the main reason that, with our members, the main reason they will support a project if it touches them personally, if they've felt something. It's not just a business decision, it's really emotional and personal. And that's what I find, reassuring and beautiful, because I could have been maybe a bit prejudiced at first before working for Promethea, saying that because we are, and they are confronted to an accusation of doing culture washing, like greenwashing. I can say that it is actually not the case. Like, it is a collection of individuals that also like going to an exhibition,
Yeah. And hey, if it's cultural washing, if it's as long as it's money coming to the arts, soak me, wash me down.
I think it depends, Phil. I'm not sure you would want all the money from the arms dealers. I don't know. I think there's probably a line for even you, Phil. I mean, this is what I find fascinating, though, about this topic of conversation, because we've already talked about, tax incentives or fiscal incentives. We talked about the corporate social responsibility and sustainable development goals. We've talked about the pride aspect, and we've also talked about the love aspect, the individual love aspect, and all of these kind of aspects play into a decision of whether a company is going to support financially or non-financially a cultural institution. I mean, I guess, Marie, in your conversations with the private sector, you have to kind of figure out where where their interest lies and what will be most interesting to them. Have you kind of changed your tactic as you've been working in Promethea? Do you feel one argument is stronger than another?
I think, at first, because, as I said, everyone now has to have sort of a CSR page, saying that we are for gender equality, for this and this and that. And at first, I was only basing myself on that, saying that, I'm making it up, but this big bank clearly positioned themselves publicly as lovers of contemporary art, gender equality, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I have a project in my portfolio called Women in Art, promoting, female artists in history. Perfect match. And then you meet the person in marketing and their interests lie completely elsewhere, and they're actually the one who will make the decision. So it's not as straightforward, and that's why I think it's also very useful. What we do is that we build a personal relationship with these 120-something businesses. We know them, and so we can cater to their need in a way because we know them personally. It's perhaps less the case with very large groups, because there is the headquarters that defined a clear strategy in terms of support to projects whether they are cultural or anything social. But with most businesses, I think it's a question of, sometimes on paper, I can present something that I feel is the perfect match to a company, and they're not really into it. And then they meet the key is to manage to have the person from the company meet the cultural operator in person. If it can go this far, it's a 90% chance of a match. But the part of my job is to think about the strategy, like which language, which little argument will, really stick and strike them. And so it takes it is marketing, really. It is it's sometimes perceived as a bad word, but actually it's quite exciting to know that you found the attach, like so yeah, that's what I told you, about the bridge. There's so many ways you can think out of the box in terms of how to introduce yourself through the wording that the company use. Especially, I know it's still a work in progress, but companies that actually build bridges would be so hilarious, construction companies.
Which we've spoken about before, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
What I find also interesting is who you're talking to within these companies. Do you find that it is the, I don't know, marketing person who's making the decision, or is it right at the top, or where does the decision lie? I mean, I guess it depends, obviously.
It really depends. Of course, if you can have, it really depends. It's always better if you can have one of the top people, but sometimes it's when it's a large group or large company, they're not accessible, first, and second, some of them will immediately redirect you to their marketing or communication team. And sometimes these people are very independent in their decision, and it's fine, but sometimes if you're only in touch with the marketing team, sometimes they really don't have the power of decision. So it really depends. But mostly, in small-scale companies, try to have someone who has the power of decision. But at the end of the day, it is going to be like the strategy will be thought in terms of marketing and communication. So that's the key person to reach, I think.
How do you find that do these people from the private sector, do they come to you? Do they seek you out, or is it a case of you using Promethea as the sort of introduction point? You've got a big organisation behind you yourself. Can you find, because sometimes the sort of wall of trying to get to that individual past the phone, past the person on the phones, get to that person who's going to make a decision. Do you have strategies for that?
Yeah, so we're not a big companies ourselves. It's 7 of us, But
you're punching above your weight. You're fine.
We have one person that does that. Her job is find new companies to expand our network of mécènes, philanthropists, or whatever you want to call them. And of course, because we already have a network, the easiest way to meet someone is to be introduced by someone they know. That's for sure. That doesn't mean that you're doomed to fail if you don't know anyone, because there are many events, and she does that as well, my colleague. You can go to a lot of networking events, make yourself seen and known regularly, and then try the good old email, if it's well crafted. Or LinkedIn. Like, there are so many ways to reach someone today. Of course, there are the how do you call that in English? GDPR, the rule now that you cannot freely share phone numbers anymore, which is a good thing for privacy, but a bit less for prospecting. But so yeah, the key is to be the ideal situation is to be introduced to someone through someone they know. But you can slowly but surely build your own network, because especially in Belgium, I find that really fascinating, because it's a small country. Brussels is a small city, it's a small capital. Even Edward, as a British man, in a foreign land, there's no way that you don't know someone who knows the person you want to reach. And in terms of who we approach, well, we are always aware of, we read the press and, trends and stuff like that to see who is actually already showing signs of being a patron of culture. And we want to invite them to join our network, because it is, I wouldn't say it is a label, because there are, of course, many companies who are not members of Promethea who are doing great things, but it is a network of people, like-minded people, I think. And of course, we like to have a direct line whenever we have a project saying that, I'm sure this is for Proximus or whoever. That's one of the goals, is to be able to provide these services to our members, to suggest projects that we know, so we have a vast knowledge of the cultural sector in Brussels, who's in need, who's new and exciting, what's going on right now, and what is strategically interesting to support at a certain point in the year, or in terms of political agendas. For example, in terms of heritage, next year is Art Nouveau year. we will clearly, if someone manifests an interest for heritage, there will be a huge year of communication around Art Nouveau projects next year. So if you want to think just in terms of strategy, this is a service we can provide to companies as well, you know.
Fascinating. I guess the sort of arrangements that you create as well between the culture and private sector will be different for each time. I guess there may be a sort of an ongoing, not subscription, but an ongoing payment to, for example, an institution like a museum or a theatre, but then also arranging, I guess, it sounds like you're talking about specific projects as well, a specific theatre piece, a specific piece of creation, yeah.
Most support, more sponsorships are project based. Unless, yes, for larger institutions there are 3 years agreement that are renewed, things like that. But it's mostly for large institutions that have, let's say, not services, but yes, let's say services to provide year long. So companies who support big institutions, especially with yearly checks. The deal usually is to be able to organize one private event, maybe yearly or something like that. So it needs to be an institution that is sound and stable and will be there and has maybe a bit more of a posh dining hall that can be, where the company can do a private event for their employees mostly, Again, it's that's something I discovered working for Promethea, is that a lot of the sponsorship give access to experience for the employees, not really for the customers or just void like communication actions. They really want to participate and to feel close, to feel like they have a personal relationship with the institution.
Mm. Well, of course, there's competition, isn't there? For if you want people to come and work for your company now, there are umpteen companies that might do the same job and pay largely a similar amount of money. If you can also say you've got a free gym, a relationship with a local theatre to get cheap tickets, and every year we have a dinner at the Musée de something, it's attractive.
And from what we hear, it's not really, well, it is to attract employees, but mainly to retain them. Especially young people who are very quick to feel like their life doesn't make sense, that they're not impactful enough. So to be able to not only say that we support the theatre, but actually once a year we go and help build something, or we can dedicate part of our time to help. Like that's something we develop a lot of. That's something I forgot to say, that of course there is financial sponsorship, but what's really effective, that's what is something we can really like develop a bit more easily, is mécénat de compétences, or exchange of skills. I don't know if you have an expression for that. Skills exchange. Exchange. And so that is really, really something that companies want to develop, and it works for all fields or all types of position within a company. So you're an actor, you're not an accountant. You can benefit from a few hours of the time of someone that will greatly help you, and the person will have a wonderful experience doing something that he or she is skilled for, but is completely outside of their work, their daily business. And sometimes it can also lead to them developing new skills. Think a bit out of the box, benefit from your creativity, and make them even better and more motivated employees. So it's really a mutually beneficial arrangement to make the two worlds collide.
Are you suggesting that I could offer singing lessons in exchange for some accountancy work?
Absolutely.
that would be very, very useful. If you've got any contacts to put me in touch in the UK, that would be lovely.
Absolutely.
I think what's interesting as a Brit living in Belgium, because Belgium is slightly more on the socialist side compared to how the economy works, but there's a lot more time capital. There's more willingness for people to give their time rather than money in Belgium, slightly compared to the UK. Whereas in the UK, I think people would, even though there are these schemes, yes, to give a day, give some time, but I think people are more ready to give money than time in the UK, and in Belgium it's slightly different, and I think that's a really nice thing. There's slightly less importance given to money, even though money is important, obviously.
Well, it's not just because of our big hearts. It's because also because it's less capitalistic. We don't make that much money. I mean, of course, there are big energy companies, but there are not a lot of million euros companies. Well, hundreds of millions or something. Some people that are able and willing to just blindly sign a check for just 50,000 euros. The average donation in company donations is 7,000 euros. It's nothing compared to what you can have in the UK. I don't know if there are studies about what the average donation is, but in Belgium, it's mostly the private philanthropists, from the King Baudouin Foundation. Personal fortunes are, I think, really well redistributed. People are generous. But in terms of company, there is such a huge way of because we have an amazing social security, companies are heavily taxed, and so there's not that, extravagant amounts of money to redistribute.
I mean, it's really, really fascinating, this insight into it's the Belgian financial system more than anything. I mean, maybe just to start concluding, I wonder if in the past few years, I have seen, let's say, complaints from the cultural sector that cultural funding from the governments, from both Wallonie, Bruxelles and the Flemish side, is decreasing. And I wonder whether you see that trend continuing, and whether there is going to be whether you see an increasing role for private sector, or you think it'll kind of remain how it is roughly now. How do you see it going?
So, I'm not really. I could not, quote the official numbers from 2018 to 22. I don't think it is decreasing. I think it's not increasing enough compared to the size of the population and the number of people with the project that needs funding. That's the problem. There is not going to be, they cannot do miracles, so there will not be more money all of a sudden. I think they will increase gradually and probably be a bit late compared to the size of the people asking for money. They did a huge effort during COVID. You will have to, recognize that a lot of funds were allocated to people in real difficulties. But I think the strategy now is going to be more towards mutualizing resources between theaters, between museums, mutualizing resources, like human resources, and in nature and in services, because there is a lot of demand and not enough money to offer, and that it is a situation. So I think it is, and it's a durable, a viable solution to share more of the resources. That's something we say in Belgium. I don't know if you have the equivalent expression, but we cannot, we're not going to reinvent warm water all the time. So there are many people who have the same idea or need the same type of infrastructure at the same time. Let's not give money to the 5. Let's give money to one for, a collective use of something. That's one thing. Of course, there is also the development, and some people find it necessary and the only way forward. Some people are complaining because, of course, it goes a bit in the other direction of our traditional socialism, and culture should not be obligated to generate profits. But of course, there is going to be the need of cultural operators to think about how to generate new revenue, whether it is through leasing their venues or something like that, or monetizing digital content, because we've been doing a lot for free on the internet, especially during COVID. And that's one of the key sources of revenue that should still be explored, I think. And of course, if we go less and less towards, let's say, socialist model, so if the fiscal situation, for example, improves for businesses, there will be more private funds for the cultural sector. But in terms of subsidies, you never know. It always depends on who's in charge. We have elections every 4 years, so I cannot predict the future.
And we all know how complicated the Belgian governance system is, yes.
I think, well, we've discussed that at length, but you are in the unfortunate situation of speaking English for your theater, because of course subsidies work for linguistic communities. So we would fund theater in French or in Flemish, but in English, sorry. And it's, I don't know. I find it ridiculous because you've proven how needed it is and how you don't want to build a theater for expats. It is because English is almost a language we use daily in Brussels, so it is clearly needed, and that's a problem. But I think if you start a project, or if you're new in the sector of culture in Belgium, one problem, let's say, is that you have to be very knowledgeable of the institutional lasagna, all the different possibilities of where you can ask for funding, whether at local to the federal level, with all the all the lasagna sheets in between.
I love that, institutional lasagna. I think it's brilliant. That's amazing. I hadn't realised, as being based in London, I haven't actually been to Brussels yet. I've not even been to visit Ed. How much you say the divide is, at least in terms of the funding that you talk about, is divided by the language.
Yes. Well, I don't know. I couldn't give you like the historical reason, but of course we've always been not a bilingual, a multilingual country. There are also like the 4 or 5 German-speaking people at the East that are always forgotten. But unless it is, well, of course there is. It makes absolutely no sense if you're talking about painting. But of course, cinema, theater, it all relies heavily on the language, and unfortunately, there are not a lot of people who are fluent enough in the other language to really appreciate the cultural production of the other linguistic community, even in Brussels, I would say. And so I don't know how long ago it was that it was decided that culture would be divided by language, but it made sense at some point and for some sectors. And of course, Brussels is stuck in the middle, as always.
I can see. I'm just sort of trying to process it, and I can see what you're talking about and where it's difficult. And I guess it sort of speaks to language is so personal, so inherently personal. It's like color of skin. The things that we can't touch about ourselves, what we're born with, and even though obviously we're not born speaking, but we're very quickly raised in a culture and in a language. But it's interesting then that a city that describes itself as multilingual, that actually what that seems to have created, and this is probably a subject for a whole other podcast, is a little bit of a divide rather than the unification.
Yes, well, I think, there are not many solutions other than really having to learn the other language, the one that's not your mother tongue, because I found it really sad that, Brussels is the majority of people are speaking French, even though we're within the Flemish territory, but historically it's always been mostly French speaking, and a lot of us, me included, my Flemish is not that good, and I find that it's really a shame. But I think one of the major problems is that when I was in high school, a lot of us only had the chance, the opportunity to have one foreign language, and of course you choose English.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marie, for this little insight into what it is to be growing up in this complicated country. I mean, the language component of Brussels is definitely a topic for another podcast, Phil. We will come back to it. For now, Marie, thank you so much for your insights. This was absolutely fascinating, really looking into the financial aspects of cultural funding, but kind of wider than that, actually. How does a society as a whole arrange itself financially? I think is really, really an interesting topic. So thank you for coming on to the show today. And thank you.
My pleasure.
And thank you, Phil, for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Marie. It's been really fascinating.
Thank you.